He had never heard his son speak. Not once. Not a single word. And yet, here he was, standing frozen in the middle of a playground, tears in his eyes, while his mute boy said something he never thought he'd hear, and to an atheist, of all people. This isn't a story about religion versus atheism. It's about the unexpected, the uncomfortable, the divine woven into the ordinary. A moment so raw and unexplainable that even the most faithful were left speechless, just like the boy had been, until now. The man in question? A pastor. A loving father who had devoted his life to serving others, healing hearts, guiding souls. But no prayer, no sermon, no Sunday service had ever been able to unlock the voice of the one person he loved the most, his own son. He had prayed for years. He had fasted. He had cried in silence when no one was watching. And still, nothing. His boy remained quiet, locked in a world of gestures and silence. No diagnosis explained it. No therapy helped. It was just silence. Every birthday was celebrated in hope. Every Christmas came with prayers. Every time his son smiled, it broke his heart, because it came without words. Without sound. Just a deep, aching stillness. Until that day. A day like any other. A trip to the park. Sunshine, laughter, children running around. And then, a stranger sat on the bench beside them, casual, unbothered, blunt. He didn't bow his head. He didn't bless his food. In fact, he said the one thing that made the pastor's stomach turn: "I don't believe in God." But what happened next wasn't a debate. It wasn't a clash of ideologies. It was something far deeper. Something that neither man expected. Something that would change both of them, forever. Why did the atheist care enough to speak to a mute child? What did he say that no one else ever did? And how is it possible that the first voice the boy ever responded to was one that didn't even believe in miracles? Stay with me. Because what happens next might just change everything you think you know, about faith, about doubt, and about the power of the unexpected. Before he was a father, he was a believer. Not just in theory, but in every beat of his heart. He had built his life around faith, around the Word, around the unshakable truth that God never makes mistakes. He preached that. He lived that. And then, his son was born. The birth was smooth. His wife cried with joy. The little boy, named Elijah, looked perfect. 10 fingers, 10 toes, wide eyes that stared straight into his soul. But as the months passed, something felt off. Elijah wasn't responding to sounds the way other babies did. He didn't babble, didn't coo. The milestones came and went, but no voice. Doctors were confused. Tests came back normal. No physical issues. No neurological disorders. Just silence. The pastor convinced himself it was a delay. Some kids take longer, he said. He'll talk when he's ready. But deep down, a quiet dread had started to grow, the kind of dread that even sermons couldn't smother. He prayed harder than ever before. Laid hands on Elijah every night. Anointed his crib with oil. Fasting became routine. He'd stand before the congregation on Sunday, preaching about miracles, while crying silently in the shower Monday morning, begging for one of his own. The community supported him. They prayed too. They brought food. Encouraged him with testimonies. But behind the smiles, behind the "God is good," was a truth no one dared to say out loud. They didn't understand why the miracle hadn't come. By the time Elijah turned 3, the silence was no longer temporary. It was permanent. No diagnosis. No medical solution. Just a boy who would look into your eyes, feel your emotions, hug you tightly, but never say a word. There were moments when the pastor's faith cracked. Quietly. Shamefully. Alone in his study, he'd ask, "Why, God? Why give me this child and this platform if I can't even lead my own son to speak?" He feared what others might think, that maybe he lacked enough faith, that maybe God was using his own child to teach him something painful. Elijah's mother was a rock. She held the family together when the pastor couldn't. Her strength came without answers, without explanations, only love. She refused to see Elijah as broken. She'd tell him stories every night, even when he never responded. She sang to him softly, brushing his hair back, whispering, "You're enough, my love, just as you are." The pastor, meanwhile, wrestled with a different storm. Publicly, he was still the man of God, full of hope. Privately, he was exhausted. He stopped asking for a miracle. It hurt too much to hope and be let down. Instead, he adjusted to the silence. learned sign language, made peace with the new rhythm of his life. But deep down, that flicker never fully died. Even when he stopped praying aloud, his heart still whispered one question every night: is there more? He watched Elijah grow, not just in size, but in spirit. The boy was gentle, thoughtful. He had a gift for sensing people's emotions. He'd comfort others with a single look. His silence wasn't empty, it was full of something sacred. And maybe, just maybe, that was the miracle, not that he would speak, but that he could love so deeply without words. Still, the pain lingered, especially in public places. The pastor hated going to events. Birthday parties, playdates, church picnics, they all came with awkward stares and pitying glances. Other kids would talk, shout, laugh, and Elijah would sit quietly, smiling, clapping, but always apart, always different. He started avoiding outings altogether. Safer to stay home. Less painful that way. But one afternoon, weary, restless, he gave in. His wife encouraged him, go to the park. Just you and him. You both need the sun. He didn't argue. Maybe she was right. He packed a snack, grabbed Elijah's favorite stuffed lion, and headed out. The day was warm, the park full of life. Children zipped across the playground. Parents chatted on benches. And for a moment, he felt almost normal. Elijah ran toward the swings. Silent, but excited. The pastor smiled, watching him pump his legs in rhythm, the wind catching his hair. It was peaceful, until he saw the man. Sitting alone on a nearby bench. No kids. No book. Just staring, relaxed, bold, with a posture that said, I don't care who's watching. And then, he lit a cigarette. At a children's park. The pastor felt the judgment rise in his throat, until the man turned to him and said something that would spark a chain of events he could never predict. But we're not there yet. Understand this, by the time they met, the pastor wasn't looking for answers anymore. He was tired. He had given up on understanding God's ways. The silence of his son had become the silence of his own faith. And in that silence, something unexpected was about to speak. And maybe, just maybe, it wouldn't come from a pulpit, a Bible verse, or even a prayer. Maybe it would come from the last person he expected, someone who didn't even believe. It was supposed to be just another day. No expectations. No agenda. Just a father taking his son to the park, like millions of other families do, all over the world, every single day. Nothing extraordinary. No signs from heaven. Just blue skies and the quiet sound of Elijah's feet brushing the pavement. The park wasn't far, a small, local one. A few swings, a faded jungle gym, 2 slides, and one of those spring-mounted animal rides that leaned slightly to one side. It wasn't fancy, but it was familiar. And after weeks of isolating at home, it felt like oxygen. The pastor had woken up feeling hollow. Not sad, not angry, just blank. That quiet kind of numb that creeps in when you've carried disappointment too long. He didn't feel spiritual. He didn't feel strong. He just felt like a man, tired, fathering a child whose silence had become a constant echo in his heart. Elijah was quiet that morning, too. He didn't resist the outing. He just grabbed his lion plushie and climbed into the car, calm and expressionless, as if part of him already knew today would matter. The drive was short. The radio was off. No worship songs. No sermons. Just the road, the wind, and 2 souls in silence. When they arrived, the playground buzzed with life. Kids yelling. A dog barking in the distance. A mom chasing her toddler with sunscreen. The kind of joyful chaos the pastor once prayed to be part of. He tried not to stare. Tried not to compare. But his eyes betrayed him. Elijah stepped out and immediately headed for the swing set. He didn't need words. His body had its own language. The pastor smiled, lifted him up, and pushed gently. Back and forth. Back and forth. Elijah's head tilted back, face to the sun, eyes closed, as if he was flying. For a moment, the pastor forgot. Then, he saw him. A man, mid-40s, maybe early 50s. Sitting alone on the far bench. No phone. No child. Just watching. Calm. Unapologetic. Dressed in a faded hoodie and jeans, legs crossed like he owned the place. And then, the cigarette. Lit casually, without hesitation. In a children's park. The pastor bristled. His instinct was to shield Elijah. To walk away. But something held him there. Something in the man's presence was oddly grounded. He didn't look dangerous. He looked settled, like someone who had made peace with his own demons. Minutes passed. The man didn't move, just glanced at Elijah once. Then looked back at the trees. Curiosity won. The pastor walked over, slowly. Sat on the opposite end of the bench, putting space between them. He wasn't sure why he sat down. Maybe it was fatigue. Maybe something else. But the man spoke first. "Beautiful day," he said, exhaling smoke without apology. The pastor nodded. "Yeah. It is." There was a pause. A long one. The kind of pause that begs to be filled. But neither of them rushed it. Finally, the man gestured toward Elijah. "Yours?" "Yes," the pastor replied. "That's my son. Quiet kid." The pastor's heart flinched. He gave a soft nod. "He doesn't speak." The man raised an eyebrow. "At all?" "No." "Ever?" "No." Silence again. Longer this time. But it wasn't awkward. It was something else. Something watching. Waiting. Then the man said something that changed everything. "I don't believe in God. Just putting that out there." The pastor turned slightly. "Okay. No offense," the man added. I figure people like you, the kind that sit with quiet kids and wear wedding rings and look like they've got some churchy thing going on, might care." The pastor gave a dry chuckle. "Used to care more." The man smirked. "Yeah, life has a way of beating faith out of us." There was another pause. But this one wasn't hollow, it was filled with something like understanding. And then, the man leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Cigarette nearly burned out. He looked at Elijah, still swinging. "Mind if I talk to him?" The pastor hesitated. He didn't say yes. But he didn't say no. So, the man stood up, and started walking toward the boy. The man approached slowly, not cautiously, but deliberately, like someone who understood the weight of what he was about to do. Elijah was still on the swing, still quiet, still lost in his world. The pastor stood now, alert but unmoving. His hands curled slightly into fists, not out of anger, but protectiveness. Every fiber of him screamed to step in, to interrupt, to control what was happening. But something told him to wait. The man knelt down beside the swing. "Hey, buddy," he said, voice calm, steady, unpretentious. Elijah didn't look at him at first. "Mind if I sit for a second?" No response. So, the man sat anyway, in the dirt, right there in front of the swing, cross-legged like a child. It was awkward, but oddly intimate. He didn't talk down to Elijah. He didn't wave or use exaggerated facial expressions like people usually did around children with special needs. He just "Saturday, you know," he began, pulling a pebble from the ground. "I used to come to parks like this all the time when I was a kid. My dad never came with me. He was too busy, or too angry. I learned early on that silence could be safer than speaking." The pastor stiffened. Elijah slowed his swinging, eyes slightly narrowed, gaze flicking to the man. "That little lion you've got." The man nodded toward the plushie in Elijah's hand. "What's his name?" Still no answer. But the boy looked down at the lion, then back up. The atheist smiled gently. "I had a bear," the man continued. "His name was Toby. He had one eye because I tore the other off when I was mad. Sometimes we do that, huh? Hurt the things that make us feel safe, because we're scared they'll disappear anyway." The pastor took a step forward, lips parting. But he stopped again. Elijah was listening. Really listening. "I don't believe in God," the man said softly, but not with pride. "I used to. Long time ago. But life has a way of kicking belief out of you when no one's watching. I figured if I stopped expecting someone to hear me, it wouldn't hurt as much when no one answered." Elijah blinked. The swing stopped completely. "But I've met people who still believe," the man continued. "Good ones. Broken ones. And I've met people who don't. And you know what I've learned?" He leaned in a little closer. "Everybody's looking for something. And sometimes the loudest search comes from the quietest place." The boy tilted his head slightly. His lips parted. The pastor's heart thudded. He didn't dare move. The man gently picked up another stone. "This rock," he said, holding it out to Elijah, "is like a word. Some people throw theirs. Some people hide them. Some people carry them their whole lives and never put them down." Then, he held out the stone. Elijah reached out, took it. His tiny fingers closed around it. The man smiled. "That's your word, if you want it. You don't have to say it. But if you ever do, no one can take it from you. The moment felt endless. The park, the noise, the sun, everything faded. There was only that circle, a man who didn't believe, a child who couldn't speak, and a father who suddenly wasn't sure what either of those facts meant anymore. And then, Elijah looked up. His mouth opened. And in a voice barely more than a whisper, he said, "Toby." The pastor gasped. A soft, breathless sound. His knees buckled. He reached for the bench to steady himself. His eyes filled instantly with tears. He had waited years. He had imagined this moment hundreds of different ways. None of them looked like this. The man didn't react with shock. He didn't laugh or cheer. He simply nodded, once, as if confirming something to himself. Elijah was still holding the rock, still holding the lion. But his gaze was fixed on the man now, like some invisible thread had stitched them together in that one word. The man leaned back, let out a slow breath. "Well," he said quietly, "guess he's got a name now." He looked toward the pastor, finally, fully, and said, "Don't worry. I didn't do anything special. I just told the truth." The pastor's voice cracked as he spoke. "You don't understand. He's never said a word. Not a single." "I know," the man interrupted gently. "That wasn't for me." And then, he stood, brushed off his jeans, dropped the used cigarette into the trash, and without another word, started walking away. But he paused, turned slightly, and said, "Sometimes the messenger doesn't believe in the message. Doesn't mean it's not real." Then he walked out of the park. No name, no explanation, just gone. The pastor ran to his son, dropped to his knees, held him tight, sobbing into his shoulder. Elijah didn't speak again. Not yet. But he didn't need to. That one word had cracked open something deeper than sound. It had rewritten what the pastor thought he knew about God, and people, and faith. That night, when they got home, the pastor sat in his study, the same room where he had once asked God why. But this time, he didn't ask questions. He gave thanks. Not for the atheist. Not even for the word. But for the strange way that grace finds its way into the cracks. Even the ones we thought were beyond repair. The moment should have felt louder. When Elijah spoke, it didn't echo across the playground. No children stopped playing. No parents looked up. The world didn't pause in dramatic awe like the pastor had imagined in his wildest dreams. There was no thunder, no doves, no heavenly chorus. Just a whisper. Just a boy. A word. And a man with his back turned, already walking away. But to the pastor, it was deafening. He dropped beside Elijah, barely able to breathe. He was shaking. His fingers trembled as they touched his son's face, as if verifying that this moment, this miraculous fracture in time, was actually happening. His heart raced, pounding in his chest like a drumbeat to a song only he could hear. "Elijah," he whispered, brushing the boy's hair aside. Did you say something?" Elijah looked at him. Calm. Innocent. His lips didn't move again, but his eyes said everything. They were steady, peaceful even. There was no fear. No confusion. Just the quiet knowing of someone who had nothing to prove. The pastor pulled him into a hug. Tight. Fierce. Not just as a father, but as a man finally breaking under the weight he'd carried for so long. Years of questions, tears, loneliness, all of it collapsed in that single word, Toby. The lion plushie was still clutched in Elijah's hand. The stone too. The pastor held his son as if anchoring himself to a new reality, one where silence didn't mean absence, and miracles didn't follow rules. For a while, they just sat there. The park around them moved on like nothing had happened. But inside the pastor's world, everything had changed. He thought of the atheist, the stranger. He hadn't said anything profound. No scripture. No "be healed." No holy theatrics. Just honest, raw humanity. And somehow, that had been enough. The pastor's mind raced. What was the meaning of this? Why now? Why him? Was this man sent by God? Or was he just a coincidence? A puzzle piece the universe slid into place at the exact right time? Could an atheist be used as a vessel for breakthrough? The old version of himself would have rejected the idea immediately. But the man who held his son now, wasn't the same man. He wiped his eyes and gently lifted Elijah, who didn't resist. Together, they walked to the car. The plushie still in his hand. The rock still in his pocket. Not one more word was spoken. But none were needed. Back at home, the pastor's wife was on the porch. She saw them walking up and smiled. But when she saw the pastor's expression, she stepped forward, concerned. What happened? He tried to speak, couldn't. His voice cracked. He swallowed hard, eyes already tearing again. Elijah, he spoke, he finally managed. He said a word. She froze. What did he say? Toby, he replied, voice barely audible. He said, Toby. Her hands flew to her mouth. The tears came instantly. She dropped to her knees and opened her arms. Elijah walked straight into them. Later that night, when the house was quiet, the pastor sat alone in the living room with the lights off. He played the moment over and over again in his head. The man, the swing, the rock, the whisper. What had just happened defied every theological framework he'd ever taught. It wasn't how miracles were supposed to happen. There had been no prayer, no oil, no scripture, no spiritual formula. Just a man with a cigarette, a scarred past, and a story. The pastor picked up his Bible. Not to preach. Not to analyze. Just to hold it. His hand gripped the leather like a lifeline, not out of ritual, but because he had nothing else to cling to. He opened it at random. His eyes landed on a verse from the book of Numbers. God is not a man, that he should lie, nor a son of man, that he should change his mind. And right under it, scribbled in the margin years ago in his own handwriting, were these words, he speaks through anything. He exhaled sharply. Almost laughed. He had written that note. He just never expected it to mean this. He thought back to every moment he had questioned God. Every time he begged, why not me? Why not now? And yet, the answer had come through someone he would have never chosen. Maybe that was the lesson. Maybe that was the miracle. The following Sunday, the pastor stood before his congregation. He didn't tell them everything. Just this, I saw a miracle last week. And it didn't come from a worship night, or a sermon, or a healing conference. It came from a cigarette-smelling man who doesn't even believe in God. And I'm telling you this because if God can use a donkey, if he can use broken men in the Bible, if he can use silence itself, then he can use anyone. There was a hush in the room. No one shouted amen. They didn't need to. Somewhere in the quiet, a deeper reverence had bloomed. A reminder that maybe faith isn't about controlling who God speaks through, but staying open enough to recognize it when he does. And sitting in the front row, holding his lion plushie in one hand and a smooth gray rock in the other, was Elijah. The days that followed were strange. Not in the way most people imagine after witnessing a miracle. There wasn't a constant stream of joy or celebration. No sudden outpouring of emotion from the pulpit. No balloons, no testimonies, no grand declarations of God did it. There was quiet, stillness. A strange mix of awe, reflection, and reverent uncertainty. The pastor found himself watching Elijah more often, waiting, listening, hoping another word might slip through. He'd listen for the creak of a bedroom door, the shuffle of small feet, the gentle hum of a child's voice testing itself again. But nothing came. Elijah remained silent. And yet, the silence had changed. It no longer carried the weight of loss or fear. It wasn't filled with desperation. It felt full, like something had been planted deep inside the boy, and now it was growing, quietly. The rock Elijah had received from the atheist remained on his nightstand. He never asked questions about it, never treated it like a toy. It was something else entirely. Some mornings, the pastor would peek in and see him just sitting there, fingers curled around the smooth edges, still, present, complete. The plush lion had taken on new meaning too. No longer just a source of comfort during difficult days, it had become a witness. A quiet companion to a sacred moment. Elijah kept it close, even when he slept. He'd whisper to it sometimes, not words, just sounds. The kind that made the pastor pause at the doorway, heart caught between hope and reverence. One night, the pastor's wife sat with him in the kitchen. They didn't speak for a long while. Then she asked softly, "Do you think that man was an angel?" He looked up from his cup, steam rising between them. "No," he answered. "I think he was exactly what he said he was, a man. One who stopped believing a long time ago. But maybe that's why it worked. Maybe it had to come from someone like him." She nodded. They didn't speak of it again. Not because it didn't matter, but because some things are too sacred to dissect. The pastor often revisited that bench in his mind. He replayed the moment again and again, not just the word Elijah spoke, but everything the man had said before it. There was something in the cadence, the simplicity. No Bible verses. No healing formulas. Just truth, unpolished and raw. And it haunted him in the best way possible. It made him rethink his own journey, the sermons he'd preached, the pressure he had placed on himself and on God. How many times had he looked for fire from heaven, when all God needed was an honest voice and an open heart? He wondered if he'd ever see the man again. That thought lingered like a loose thread in the back of his mind. Part of him hoped he would. Part of him hoped he wouldn't, because how do you thank someone who didn't ask for credit? He didn't tell the full story to anyone, not even to the church board. He shared the miracle, yes. But the details? The atheist, the cigarette, the rock? Those remained locked in his heart, protected like a secret between him and the divine. But something shifted in the way he preached. He stopped leaning so heavily on certainty. He left room for mystery. He began to speak more about the in-between spaces, the silences, the unanswered prayers, the odd and sometimes offensive ways God chooses to move. One Sunday, he looked out at his congregation and said, "Some of the most powerful messages I've ever heard didn't come from a pulpit. They came from pain, from honesty, from people who don't have it all figured out, but who show up anyway. Sometimes, the people we least expect carry the words we most need." There was a quiet murmur. Not of confusion, but recognition. That evening, after a quiet dinner, the pastor tucked Elijah into bed. The boy was already holding his lion. The stone sat right beside him. The pastor knelt down, kissed his forehead, and lingered. "You don't have to say another word, son," he whispered. "You've already said more than most people say in a lifetime." Elijah opened his eyes, just a sliver, and smiled. And in that smile, the pastor saw it again. The miracle wasn't the word. It wasn't the moment in the park. The real miracle was what came after, the echo, the ripple, the stillness that followed. It was what changed him. Not his son's voice, but his own. He never looked at his calling the same way again. For years, the pastor had carried the silent burden of needing to be the answer for everyone. The counselor, the healer, the one with all the right words at all the right times. And yet, the one thing he couldn't fix had lived under his own roof, his son. Before that day at the park, he often questioned his usefulness. How could he lead a congregation if he couldn't lead a breakthrough in his own family? How could he preach faith when his own had grown tired? He still loved God, deeply, but he had stopped expecting anything new. Miracles, to him, were stories, not possibilities. But Elijah's single word shattered that thinking. It reminded him that faith doesn't need formulas, it needs surrender. That God doesn't follow outlines, he writes his own. And perhaps most importantly, it reminded him that God doesn't need our permission to move, and sometimes he moves through the very people we've spent our lives trying to save. The encounter with the atheist became a turning point, not because of theology, but because of truth. Honest, unfiltered, wounded truth. And that truth carried something sacred. It disarmed the walls around Elijah's silence. Not because it was perfect, but because it was real. The pastor began to preach differently. He still shared the gospel, but now he left more space for mystery. He encouraged questions. He admitted that sometimes, he didn't have the answers. And surprisingly, that honesty drew more people in than his certainty ever had. He noticed that people started showing up not just for what he knew, but for how he was learning, publicly, vulnerably, slowly. His sermons stopped sounding like lectures. They started sounding like conversations with an invisible God who didn't always shout back, but who always listened. He started visiting that same park more often, not in search of the man, but in search of the reminder, the stillness. The chance to sit on the same bench and remember that God doesn't need credentials, doctrine, or even belief to show up. He just needs a moment, and someone willing to sit in it. Most days, Elijah came too. Still quiet, still thoughtful, but somehow lighter. He'd sit beside his father on the bench, lion in one hand, rock in the other. The two of them would just sit. No pressure for more words. No expectation for another miracle. Just presence. And slowly, that became enough. The pastor realized he had spent years trying to hear God in the spectacular, in the loud, in the grand. But now, he had found him in a whisper, in a word, in the silence that followed. He used to measure his ministry by results, salvations, baptisms, how many people cried at the altar. Now, he measured it by something quieter. How many people walked away feeling a little less alone, a little more seen, a little more willing to sit in silence, and trust that God might still be speaking. The transformation wasn't overnight. It was slow, but it was real. The old pastor would have preached about the miracle. The new one lived in the aftermath of it, quietly, humbly, and with a heart more open than ever before. Because sometimes, the greatest breakthrough doesn't come in what we gain. It comes in what we finally let go of. Elijah never spoke much after that day. But the pastor no longer saw that as a loss. Because one word, one honest, unexpected, God-breathed word, had changed everything. And more importantly, it had changed him. He used to believe that miracles had to be big, loud, visible. He thought they had to make sense, follow a pattern, come with confirmation. But now he understood something deeper. Sometimes, the most divine moments arrive quietly, wrapped in mystery, delivered by people we'd never choose, in places we'd never expect. Sometimes, they show up on a playground, in the form of a cigarette-smoking stranger who doesn't believe, and yet speaks the exact sentence that opens a locked soul. The man never came back, and maybe he never will. But his presence lingers. In the rock Elijah still holds. In the word Toby. In the silent bond between father and son that now carries more meaning than 1,000 conversations ever could. The pastor continues to preach. But he does so from a place of humility, of awareness that God is not confined to church walls or holy vocabulary, that he can use the broken, the doubting, the least expected, and he often does. His son remains mostly silent, but their home is not quiet. It's full of laughter, of glances that speak louder than words, of love that doesn't need language to prove itself. And that bench at the park? It's still there. He visits it often, not to look for miracles, but to remember he already received one. So if you're watching this, and you've been waiting for your breakthrough, wondering why your prayers seem unanswered, why God feels silent, maybe this story is your reminder. God is still moving, just maybe not in the way you imagined. And the messenger? He might look nothing like what you expected. But the message will find you. And when it does, everything will change. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to One Chair Empty. Because somewhere out there, someone is still waiting, and there's always one chair left for the next miracle.